Hello, I'm Helen, I'm 64. To tell my story, I need to go back 25 years. The oncology department, with its windowless rooms, was located within the center of the hospital so as to better accommodate both immunocompromised patients as well as patients like my husband, Daniel, who were receiving radioactive iodine treatments. During those last weeks, my son, James, and I were frequent visitors to Daniel's room. The air in this ward carried an unshakable sterility that felt like the inside a refrigerator. Daniel's hands, once calloused from roofing, lay inert atop the covers. The chairs were uncomfortable, not helped by the gravity of my husband's condition. The monitor that squatted above Daniel's head beeped with a metronome-like pulse. The sound drew my eyes to the incomprehensible information that was displayed on the monitor. The murmur of medical staff in the hallway was faint and ethereal, as if Daniel's room was a lifeboat that had somehow drifted away from the rest of the hospital. James had been silent for nearly an hour. Having long since tired of counting the ceiling tiles, he had borrowed my phone to play games. When the door opened, Daniel was startled. He squeezed my hand to near numbness. Dr. Patel entered the room. His solemn eyes were fixed upon the patient. The doctor stared at Daniel, as though by only speaking to my husband, he could avoid any messy emotions. "How are you feeling today?" asked the doctor. Daniel did not answer for a long time. He blinked before he replied to the oncologist. "My bones feel like glass," he managed. His hoarse voice caused me to scramble to hold a plastic cup of water to his mouth, which he was able to sip through a straw. Dr. Patel sighed. "I'm afraid the latest scan has not shown improvement." For some reason, I couldn't bear to look at him. I focused instead upon his hands. Patel spoke again. "The cancer has spread. The new lesions in the liver, well, they're multiplying." He let the silence flood the room. At this point, further treatment would be non-curative. James's hand lost some of its pressure on mine. "Is there anything else that could be done?" My voice caught. I had planned to be steady for this eventuality. I had rehearsed saying this in the bathroom at home, schooling my expression so as to avoid worrying James. "There is palliative care," Dr. Patel said. He made this sound merciful. "We can keep him comfortable. We can either transfer him to hospice care or send him home." The word hospice unzipped something inside me. I heard it as a bell ringing from the bottom of a well. I tried to let it ring and to then fade away. The thought of bringing Daniel home to die absolutely terrified me. I didn't want our home to be associated with the memory of his death. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if pushing his remaining breath into the world. "I'll go to hospice care," he said, absolving me of having to voice my selfish feelings. James looked up from his game. "What's hospice care?" he asked. He looked confused. "But he's still sick, isn't he? Why would coming home be a choice if he's not well?" I could see the beginnings of understanding pulling at the corners of his mouth as he jumped to his feet. "I'm dying, James," whispered Daniel. "Please," I said, but I was speaking to the bedsheet, not the doctor. "There has to be another option." Dr. Patel's mask bent again. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The doctor left to give us some time to ourselves. An orderly later came with a wheelchair to transfer Daniel to hospice care. His new room had natural sunlight and freshly cut flowers. As Daniel was being moved, a nurse named Tasha explained in a steady voice about how hospice care would make the transition as gentle as possible. "He'll sleep more and more," she said. "We can increase his pain medication to minimize any suffering." For the next week, James drifted in and out of lucidity. When he was with me, he reminisced about our life, our honeymoon in Barbados, the birth of James, and the rental cabin in Michigan. He spoke of regrets that included missing our son's high school graduation and other milestones like college, career, marriage, and children. Daniel apologized that he wouldn't be with me to spend our golden years together. He died a week later. He simply stopped breathing, and the monitors gave up their pulse. Although I called for help, I knew that he had passed even before a doctor checked him. The one blessing was that James wasn't there. He was at school when his father died. The hospital was briskly efficient. While a grief counselor spoke with me, Daniel's body was transferred to the mortuary. So began the logistics of death, aided in large part by the fact that Daniel and I had already made funeral arrangements. After Daniel passed, the hospital called our designated funeral home. A hearse from the funeral home arrived at the hospital to transport Daniel's body. His funeral was held just 5 days later. The funeral home arranged and coordinated the floral arrangements, music, eulogies, and burial service. The service was well attended. My sister and Daniel's 2 adult siblings were there, along with several of our friends, neighbors, and co-workers. James did not cry at the funeral. He sat next to me during the service, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed upon one of the church's stained glass windows. The potluck funeral reception that followed at the First Baptist Church were the 2 longest hours that I had ever endured in my life. Everyone told me that they were sorry. Everyone had a story to tell about loss and heartache. Everyone had an experience to share about a loved one who had been lost to cancer. Throughout this ordeal, Caleb, Daniel's brother, was a steady and supportive figure. Without Caleb, I think that I would have lost it. There were simply too many stories about loss and grief. I understand that everyone was just trying to help, but the sheer amount of grief, sadness, and misery that was being shared was very nearly overwhelming. I was able to shield James from most of this. After getting his food, he and a handful of other children went to the church's activity room, where Pastor Melody kept them occupied. After returning home, James retreated to his room and shut the door. I let him be, wanting to give him whatever space he needed. The day that Daniel was buried, I broke into tears after returning home. I cried after realizing that Daniel's side of the bed still held the faint indentation of his body and the smell of his cologne. For a time, our home was crowded because Daniel's siblings and my sister stayed with us to provide support, as James and I struggled to transition to a post-Daniel world. In the days to follow, James and I did our best to pick up the shattered pieces of our lives. James and I saw a grief counselor, initially together, but later separately. James returned to school while I returned to work as a bookkeeper for Reynolds Trucking. In the aftermath of the funeral was the need to set up a payment plan to pay for the medical bills that our health insurance hadn't covered. I had to go to probate court to get Daniel's will validated and to have my role as executor confirmed. I also had to cancel Daniel's credit cards and to settle any outstanding accounts. In the weeks that followed, I felt as though I had become a ghost of myself. I floated from work to home and back again, powered by caffeine and inertia. It was not Daniel's passing that hollowed me out. It was the paperwork. The bills piled up, pale blue and off-white, each one a little more insistent. The hospital called to say they had made a clerical error and that another $2,000 had come due. The funeral home wanted payment in full. The mortgage company sent a letter with "You Argent" in red at the top. In the evening, after James had gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen and tallied the debts on a spreadsheet. With hospital care, healthcare costs, and funeral expenses, I was looking at a medical and funeral debt of over $125,000. Whereas we had once been a 2-income family, with Daniel's passing, we had lost 45% of our monthly net income. On top of everything else, Daniel still owed payments on his truck, which I couldn't sell throughout the 6 months that were needed for the probate court to validate his will. I found myself wondering what would happen if James and I were to simply walk away, moving abroad to a non-extradition country like Costa Rica to escape this debt. I pictured the house dissolving into dust, the school forgetting my son's name, and the bank's letters piling up until they formed a dam that stopped time. Needless to say, I toiled on, taking one day at a time. I made the minimum payments, kept the lights on, and held off the creditors. I had never expected to be a widow. The term felt like an ill-tailored coat. As people continued to call to offer their condolences, I accepted them with the grace of someone who had become practiced with this routine. In the weeks and months to follow, Jane, who was our dispatcher, took me under her metaphorical wing. While we had always been friendly, I was surprised when she invited me to lunch at a nearby diner. "How are you, my dear?" asked Jane. She held up a hand as I began to offer a neutral answer. "Yes, I know. You're going to say that you're okay, but how are you really? You seem unusually stressed." I don't know if it was the warmth of her tone or the fact that she reminded me of my mother, who had passed on some 10 years earlier. I broke into tears. I found myself telling Jane about the massive debt we had incurred as a result of my husband's death. Not only was she a kind and sympathetic listener, but she also put me in touch with a credit counselor who was able to negotiate lower interest rates on my behalf. On the first day of October, I drove James to the cemetery after school. The ground was damp, the air raw with the first warning of winter. I stood by the newly placed headstone and read the chiseled name as though it belonged to someone else. James stared at the gravestone, For a moment I thought he would say something. "I miss him too," I finally said, though my words felt inadequate. Somewhere nearby, a backhoe shuddered to life and startled me. But James didn't even flinch. That night, after James had gone to bed, I opened the fridge and stared at the contents. 3 eggs, a yogurt, half an orange, and a jar of mayonnaise. With my budget already stretched to the breaking point, I called Jane on the verge of tears. After learning about my predicament, she told me about a local food bank, our neighbor's pantry. In the morning, without money for groceries, I did something that I never thought that I would ever do. I visited the food bank. I almost cried when a volunteer gave me a box full of groceries. There were jars of spaghetti sauce, bags of pasta, a bag of rice, and several mystery foods that were missing their labels. Upon learning that I had a child, the food bank gave me a gallon of milk, a box of cereal, and a package of cheese. At home, after unpacking the groceries, I found 2 packages of ground beef and 1 of boneless chicken breasts. With our immediate food needs sorted, I did an online search and applied for a part-time bookkeeping job that I could do remotely. On Monday, to my surprise, Jane greeted me with a casserole. "Here's a little something for your family," smiled my colleague and patted me on my shoulder. The day got even better. Shortly after lunch, my personal phone rang with an offer of employment for the part-time job that I had applied for on Saturday night. It was hard to work 60 hours a week while raising a child as a single parent, but I somehow did it. James grew up by inches, not milestones. His face thinned out, his hair darkened, and his arms and legs seemed to take turns outpacing each other. We passed the years in small increments. His first F on a math quiz, his first crush, his first date, and a cat we tried and failed to keep indoors. I measured my own life by the rise and fall of his backpack, by how many dinners he ate at the table as opposed to eating in his bedroom while hunched over his computer. 8 years passed. College acceptance arrived on a Saturday in April. The envelope that James retrieved from the mailbox looked thick and official. He tore it open in the driveway and stood there for a long moment, reading and rereading the letter. My breath caught in my throat. Had he been rejected? I watched from the kitchen window, pretending a nonchalance that I didn't feel. He came in and set the letter on the counter. "I got in," he said. My heart swelled with pride. I made spaghetti to celebrate, the same recipe that Daniel had cooked on their fishing trip weekends. By August, we were neck-deep in checklists. Dorm sheets, a hot plate, the old hatchback barely roadworthy. The morning we packed the car, the sun was sharp and bright. I arranged James's boxes in the trunk with the geometry of someone used to moving the unmovable. We drove to state together with him in the driver's seat and me holding the directions and reading them even when I knew the route by heart. The roads were choked with construction, with orange cones lining the highway for miles and restricting traffic flow. James drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles white. At his dorm, the air buzzed with newness. The halls were filled with parents, students, loud music, and the smell of cardboard and pizza. After James had unpacked all of his belongings from the car and moved them to his dormitory room, I sat in the car, watching the students mill about, and realized I had no reason to stay. I waited until I was sure he wouldn't see me, and then permitted myself to cry. Not loudly, but enough to leave the taste of salt on my lips. The drive home was a vacuum. I rolled the windows down, letting the air and noise rush in. The house felt enormous without hymn rooms echoing with old smells. The cat's empty bed, the fridge with milk that would go sour before I could finish it. I filled the time with work. I took on overtime, weekends, whatever kept me from noticing the clock. When Jane, who had by now become a close friend, insisted that I take breaks now and again, inviting me to join her and her husband, Frank, for dinner. Whenever James called, it was always late, his voice thinned by distance and static. "Hey Mom," he'd say, "I need some help with my FAFSA." Or, "Can you mail me my old calculator?" Or, "Could you send me Dad's spaghetti recipe?" Although he never called just to talk, I cherished each call. I even kept his texts in a separate folder, scrolling through them in the quiet moments. By prearrangement with James, I only called him on Friday nights. Whenever I called, I worried that I'd interrupt his social life. Worse yet, I worried that he would be alone. 4 years passed this way, the seasons blurring together. Each fall, I visited for family weekend, bringing brownies and a new comforter. He came home for the holidays, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. Every spring seemed to bring a new crisis, a failed class, a lost student ID, or roommate drama. As he adjusted to college life, his emails became shorter and less frequent. His love of history initially had him leaning towards becoming an archaeologist, but given the political instability of so many regions where there were major digs, he decided to share his love of history by teaching. The day of his graduation, I woke at dawn and sat in the driveway for an hour before leaving. The campus was swamped, everyone moving in slow, choreographed lines. The stadium was filled to capacity with spectators in the stands, while the graduates were seated in rows on the field. James's name was near the end of the program. I counted down the pages, each name a mile marker, with over 13,000 graduates in both the undergraduate and graduate programs. The undergraduates weren't called to the stage, but were instead graduated by their respective colleges. After the ceremony, the crowds poured onto the quad. I found James by the fountain, gown unzipped, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. "Congratulations," I said, and pulled him in for a hug. We went out for sandwiches at the only restaurant that wasn't mobbed. While he ate, I asked about his future plans. "Maybe teaching," he said, "or grad school, if I can get in." We sat there, the only mother and son in a room full of strangers, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself believe there might be more ahead than behind. When I drove home that night, the sky was ablaze with late summer clouds, and the edges of the world seemed soft and forgiving. I parked in the driveway, turned off the car, and sat in the quiet until the dash clock blinked over to midnight. For once, I did not feel like a ghost. I climbed the stairs and went to sleep, dreaming of things not yet lost. In the end, financial realities forced James to look for a job while temporarily abandoning his dreams of graduate school. He took a job as a history teacher at a mid-sized high school in the northern part of the state. At the start of the school year, he sent me a copy of the picture that had been used for his district ID. I framed this picture and put it on the mantel above the fireplace. 19 years passed. As with his time in college, throughout the passing years, he continued to return home for Thanksgiving, as well as Christmas. From time to time, James would tell me about his dating life. Pamela was a teacher whom he had met during an educational conference. She worked in his district, though not at his school. He met Stacy after he was accidentally hit in the side of his head during an after-school baseball gamble. Stacy was the attending physician at the health clinic he visited. Emily was a pharmaceutical rep he met through a dating site. None of these relationships ever worked out. I don't know why. He never said, and since I didn't want to press him, I never asked. During the spring of 2020, he sent me a picture of his empty classroom. The district had adopted social distancing due to the COVID outbreak. To avoid overcrowding these classrooms, students only came to class on alternate days. All students, faculty, and staff were masked. Students who were not on campus participated remotely through Google Meets. On a Friday in March of 2020, James called me during lunch. By now, he was 40 years old, and I was nearing retirement. I was at home where I was working on my remote part-time job. "Hey, Mom," said James. "Have you seen the news?" He rushed on before I could respond. "The state is closing all schools for 2 weeks due to the COVID outbreak. Will you be okay?" I asked. He laughed. "I'm not the one you should worry about. The kids are going to drive their parents insane." He sounded fine, but I heard the nervousness in his voice. I asked if he needed groceries, toilet paper, or hand sanitizer. These were all items that were now in short supply due to hoarding. "I'm good," he insisted. I began stocking back in January after learning that the Chinese hadn't locked down their borders during the initial outbreak that occurred during the Chinese New Year. With so many people who were traveling because of this holiday, I was afraid that the virus would be spread worldwide. I nodded. I remembered receiving a call from James back in January. After James had passed on his disturbing thoughts, I had stocked up on my own supplies. After calling Jane, she had done the same. The next time we spoke, he had been home for a week and a half. I could hear the growing stress in his voice. "We're pivoting to virtual education. The district is issuing laptops to all students. We've been given 5 days to set up virtual classrooms, but no training has been provided for how to do this." James told me about he and his colleagues had used YouTube to learn how to set up their virtual classrooms. I could hear the stress in his voice, but also his pride as he told me about how he would be ready for his district's virtual launch. As for myself, when the state announced a statewide closure of all non-essential businesses, I was able to keep working, albeit remotely, because trucking was an essential business. As a dispatcher, Jane remained on the job in person at the company's communications center. Her husband, Frank, who was a mechanic at Reynolds Trucking, was also working in person. Although working from home initially felt like a vacation and a reprieve from my daily commute, by the end of the second week, I was talking to myself and misplacing my phone. The news cycle became a drumbeat with a growing daily count of the dead and the newly infected. Images on television showed empty streets and sidewalks in what had once been bustling cities. It was completely surreal. I found myself wondering if we had reached the end of times. I didn't hear from James for a few days. I left him alone, knowing that he needed time to adjust to virtual education. Despite this understanding, I couldn't shake the image of him holed up and alone, watching old episodes of Jeopardy and eating ramen as he had as a teen whenever he was stressed out. He called again on a Wednesday. I answered on the first ring. "Hey, Mom." His voice was flat and anxious. I waited, sensing that he was on the verge of making an important announcement. He let out a sound half laugh, half sigh. "I don't think I want to teach anymore." He told me how students were either ditching his virtual class or how they would log in while muting their video feed in violation of district instructions. "I think they're logging in, muting their video feed, and playing video games," sighed James. "Their grades are down, and I'm under pressure to get their grades back up." I felt the old instinct to reassure, to patch his hurt with understanding and platitude. But nothing came out. "That's okay," I finally said. "You can do something else. You're educated. You have options." He was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said, "I guess I do." James quit his teaching job 2 days later. I felt the floor metaphorically shifting beneath me. James was 40 years old. I wondered what he would now do for a living. Another week passed. James had called to ask if he could temporarily move back home while he sorted things out. I readily agreed. How could I not? He was my son. 2 weeks later, he arrived at my door with a U-Haul truck that was filled with his belongings. Most of what he owned was stored in the garage. When I asked what James had done with his car, he told me that his car had been leased and that he had returned it to the dealership. Although how James would get to his job interviews without a car, I suppose that given the current circumstances, most such arrangements would now be virtual. "Thanks, Mom," he said after he had moved back into his bedroom. "Of course," I said in reply. "You're my son, anything for family." It did not take long for James to revert to his teenage patterns. This time around, instead of staying up late to study, he now played video games or watched movies. He ate up the food in my refrigerator and left his dirty dishes in the sink. He left his dirty laundry piled in a hamper in the laundry room. He expected me to make all of his meals, with breakfast being served at 10 in the morning. His lunch was my dinner, which was served at 6 p.m. sharp. Since I wasn't about to get up at midnight or later to make him a late dinner, I left the fixings for sandwiches in the refrigerator. After making a sandwich, he never cleaned up after himself. In the morning, I'd find a dirty chef's knife and cutting board on the counter with another plate in the sink. He also started leaving post-it notes on the refrigerator door. "We're out of mayo. Could you get some cheese puffs? We need more cold cuts. Could you pick up some ribeye steaks?" We had our first argument after I asked James to mow the yard. "I'll get to it," he told me. After 3 days, I had it out with him. "I'm still on the job," I told my entitled son. "I'm working 60 hours a week. You're not working. Would it be too much for me to expect that you help out? I have things to do, and I'm going through a lot of stuff," came his reply. In the end, James mowed the yard. He didn't have much of a choice because this was a situation of my house, my rules. Although part of me was sorry to have laid down the law, since I was working 60 hours a week, I had other things to do than to baby a man-child. My decision to talk to James had come after weeks of having made excuses for him, telling myself that he was stressed out and just needed some time to get his head together. At night, I heard him in the family room, the faint sound of the television marking his location. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night to find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, lost in thought. "I'll only be here for a bit," he said one night, as if reading my mind. "Just long enough until I figure things out." "That'll be fine," I said, meaning every word at the time. 3 months after the state had closed all non-essential businesses, the COVID restrictions ended. James continued to live with me. I told myself that this was because the schools hadn't yet returned to full in-person instruction. Only hybrid instruction with social distancing and masking was available. As the weeks turned into months, I began to wonder if James was even looking for a job. When I asked James about how his job search was going, he would become both defensive and evasive. "I'm reviewing several opportunities. I've got options," insisted James. "Tell me about these options," I demanded. Whoa, what's with the 3rd degree?" demanded James. "You're playing a computer game. How is this helping you to find a job?" "I'm just taking a break. I'm not a working machine like you," retorted my son. The words felt like a slap. Was James so naive as to believe that I enjoyed working a 60-hour week? I had never told him about all of the debt that his father had left. As I stumbled away, James dropped his tablet to apologize. "Ma, I didn't mean that the way it sounded. Ma, I'm sorry." The passing weeks and months became a recurring cycle of arguments and oft-repeated excuses. Job interviews were allegedly rescheduled. The offered salaries were too low. Prospective employers had unrealistic expectations. James didn't want to work for a supervising manager who was half his age. The work hours were erratic and would have included working nights, weekends, and holidays. He didn't want an outdoor job. He didn't want a job that was too physical or dangerous. He had a moral objection to retail jobs because he didn't want to be pressured into selling products to people who might not actually need them. His list of reasons for not wanting this job or that seemed endless. His excuses also ignored the fact that he was a fully grown and able-bodied man who needed to make his own way in the world. 6 years after James moved in with me, I was nearing retirement. Call me selfish, but I didn't want to spend my retirement years by having to take care of my adult son. At home, we were again having on-again, off-again arguments about his need to help out around the house. All I really wanted was for him to pick up after himself. I didn't want the responsibility for cleaning his bedroom, making his meals, or doing his laundry. Throughout the past 6 years, I hadn't been able to use my garage. With an extra person in residence, I had higher monthly bills for food and utilities. Throughout this time, James had not paid rent or contributed to any of our household expenses. As much as I loved my son, I had reached my limit in enabling his freeloader lifestyle, and so it was that I found myself in the reception area for Ms. Lopez, an attorney who specialized in real estate law, which included knowledge in how to legally file an eviction. After greeting me, Ms. Lopez led me to a conference room where she invited me to be seated. I explained that I was the sole owner of my home and that James was not a tenant. "This simplifies things," observed Ms. Lopez. "Since he's an occupant, standard eviction procedures don't apply. He only needs a written 30-day notice to vacate." "Is there any way that I could include a written offer with this letter?" I asked. "What do you have in mind?" asked Ms. Lopez. Since I didn't want James to be homeless, I offered to pay the security deposit, 3 months' rent, and utility connection fees for a modest apartment. I also offered to pay for movers to transport all of his belongings to his new apartment. I even offered to give James $10,000 to facilitate this transition. "I can include this offer," smiled the attorney. Within 24 hours, Ms. Lopez had emailed a notice of eviction that included my offer to James. I printed out the offer after my workday had ended at Reynolds Trucking. I waited until after dinner to give James his eviction package. "You're evicting me?" asked James. The words were blunt. I felt them like a slap. "Fine," said James, who abruptly got up and walked away. I heard James shut his bedroom door with the finality of a castle's lord who had just raised his drawbridge. When I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, I found that my hands were shaking. I lasted an hour before I broke down and texted him. "I'm sorry," I wrote. "I hope you can forgive me." The reply came within 5 minutes. "It's okay. I should have left a long time ago." When I tried calling him, the phone went to voicemail. "You've reached Jack," announced his voice. "Leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." Uncertain now as to whether I had done the right thing, I called Jane. "It's not as though you're just kicking him to the curb," observed my friend. 3 months paid rent, activated utilities, moving expenses, and $10,000 in cash. That's a generous offer. I was on metaphorical pins and needles while I was at work the next day. Although I checked my phone and email frequently to see if James had responded to my invitation, there had been no reply. At the end of the day, I hurried home to find the garage door open. The belongings that had filled my garage for the past 6 years were gone. Worried that perhaps we had fallen victim to a home invasion, I cautiously entered the house. James was gone. His bedroom was empty of all of his possessions. I checked my phone to see if he had left voicemail, email, or a text message. There was nothing. Any place that he might have left a handwritten note was likewise empty. When I tried calling James, instead of a dial tone, I got an automated message. "The number you have dialed is unavailable," announced a voice. I couldn't believe what was happening. Had James blocked my number? An email that I sent was returned with a delivery failure notification. His Facebook page was unavailable. My sister said that she hadn't heard from James in months. None of our other relatives knew what had happened to him. I wonder now what I did wrong. Had I become too emotionally distant for James to talk to me about his problems? Had I been a bad parent? Had I been overly harsh in wanting him to move out after 6 years? Do you think I hurt his feelings when I offered to pay for 3 months' rent on an apartment? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. Update. My sister recently emailed this picture from my son's Instagram account. James is living in Costa Rica, where he is employed as a history teacher at an international American school. In another Instagram post, in which James shared a picture of a plate of paella, this image was accompanied by the hashtag living the best life. While I was relieved to learn that James hadn't been found lying dead in a ditch, I continue to wonder what I did wrong to make James break off all contact. Update 2. I am now seeing a therapist named Dr. Stivic. She has helped me to understand that James financially abused me by having taken advantage of free room and board for 6 years. She said that it was important to understand that his behavior is ultimately his responsibility. As to why he terminated contact, she suggested many reasons for this behavior, such as difficulty with adjusting to life changes, personal issues, or even mental health struggles. She further observed that my actions, like offering 3 months' rent for an apartment, financial support, and setting boundaries, were reasonable and necessary for our mutual well-being. Although reconciliation and communication might be possible in the future, for now, my therapist thinks that I need to take care of myself and that I shouldn't dwell on perceived past mistakes. Shortly after I retired, I took my first vacation in over 35 years. I went on a 2-week Caribbean cruise. It felt odd, not having to be at work or having to follow a set schedule. The sound of the ocean's waves, the warmth of the sun's kiss upon my skin, and the smell of the salty air were all incredibly relaxing. My cabin was surprisingly spacious and had the most incredible view. The food was truly first-rate. I even made some friends through one of the ship's social groups, the Silver Foxes. In recent weeks, I have come to understand that self-worth is not about external validation or achievements like being a mother or a successful bookkeeper. Self-worth is the internal sense of being valuable and deserving of respect and love. While I am open to re-establishing communication with James, should he ever decide to reach out, I'm not going to obsess over what happened or why he chose to exclude me from his life. Standing now at the start of my golden years, I look forward to seeing what the future has in store for me. Are you a parent with estranged children? Are you an adult with estranged parents? How have you dealt with your respective situations? Do you hold out any hope for a future reconciliation? As I explore my own relationships, I would appreciate hearing from different perspectives. Reconciliation is admittedly not always possible, especially since it takes the willingness of both parties to communicate. If you're in a toxic relationship that is emotionally, physically, and financially draining you, sometimes your only reasonable option is to walk away. Family doesn't have to be a coincidence of birth. Family can also be those people whom you choose to spend time with. People who respect and value you for the person that you are. In a healthy relationship, the metaphorical scales are balanced, with each person giving and receiving in equal measure. If all the other person does is to take and take and take, that's not love. That's not even an example of family helping family. That's abuse, plain and simple.